Picture this. July 9th, 2002, Durban, South Africa, 53 African heads of state stand together in one room, not for a funeral, not for a war council, but for a birth after centuries of colonial division, after decades of Cold War manipulation, after countless attempts at unity that crumbled into dust. Africa is trying something it has never successfully done before. One continent, one voice, one future. But here's what they don't tell you. This wasn't the first attempt. It wasn't even the second. And the man who dreamed it up, he was killed for it. What you're about to discover is the hidden story of Africa's most ambitious project since independence. A story of visionaries and dictators, of hope and betrayal, of a continent trying to heal itself while the world watches and waits for it to fail. This is the untold story of the African Union. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I am your guide through one of the most significant moments in modern African history, a moment that gets barely a footnote in world history books, but represents something profound, Africa's attempt to reclaim its destiny. Today, we are diving deep into the formation of the African Union in 2002. But this isn't just a story about politicians signing documents. This is a story about identity, about what it means to be African in a world that divided your continent with rulers and pens, about whether 50-plus nations, each with their own languages, cultures, and conflicts, can truly become one. We'll take you back to the roots of Pan-Africanism. We'll walk through the failed experiments that came before. We'll introduce you to the dreamers and the cynics, the revolutionaries and the compromises, and we'll reveal the hidden forces both inside and outside Africa that shaped this continental union. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand why the African Union was born from the ashes of a failed organization, how Libya's controversial leader became its greatest champion, what secrets and struggles marked its creation, and most importantly, whether it's actually working. Because here's the truth most people miss. The African Union isn't just about politics. It's about post-colonial healing. It's about whether Africa can write its own story or whether it will forever be written by others. Let's go back to where it all began. The year is 2002. The world is reeling from September 11th. America has invaded Afghanistan. The war on terror dominates global headlines. In this new world order, Africa is once again being overlooked. But if you zoom into the African continent itself, you see something different. You see a continent in transition. Apartheid has been dead for less than a decade. Nelson Mandela is no longer president, but his rainbow nation dream still echoes. Zimbabwe is descending into chaos under Robert Mugabe. Sierra Leone is emerging from a brutal civil war. Rwanda is still counting its dead from the 1994 genocide. This is a continent carrying the weight of its recent past. Colonial borders drawn by Europeans in the 1880s still divide ethnic groups and create tension. The Cold War has ended, but its proxy conflicts left Africa littered with weapons and fractured governments. To understand why the African Union matters, we must understand what colonialism did to Africa. Before European colonization, Africa had kingdoms, empires, trade networks. From the Mali Empire to the Kingdom of Congo, from Great Zimbabwe to the Ashanti Confederacy, Africa governed itself. Then came the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. 13 European nations and the United States sat in a room in Germany and carved up Africa like a birthday cake. No Africans were invited. No African voices were heard. They drew straight lines across maps, cutting through ethnic territories, separating families, creating artificial nations. The scramble for Africa wasn't just about taking land, it was about erasing African identity and replacing it with European control. By 1914, only two African nations remained independent, Ethiopia and Liberia. The rest were colonies ruled by foreigners, their resources extracted, their people subjugated. But colonialism did something else. It planted an idea in the minds of Africans. Maybe our artificial divisions make us weak. Maybe our unity is our strength. The dream of African unity didn't start in Africa. It started in the diaspora. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, enslaved Africans and their descendants in the Americas began asking dangerous questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What connects us? Leaders like Marcus Garvey in Jamaica, W.E.B. Du Bois in America, and George Padmore in Trinidad started preaching a radical idea. All people of African descent share a common struggle. And that struggle requires unity. They called it Pan-Africanism, the belief that Africa and its scattered children must unite politically, economically, spiritually to resist oppression and reclaim dignity. By the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, African leaders on the continent itself were joining the movement. Future presidents like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya attended. They made a declaration. Colonial rule must end. African independence must begin. And when it does, Africans must unite. Between 1957 and 1975, the map of Africa transformed. One by one, colonies became countries. Ghana became independent in 1957 under Nkrumah's leadership. Then Guinea, then Nigeria, then Congo. By 1960, known as the Year of Africa, 17 nations gained independence. But independence exposed a harsh truth. Political freedom doesn't equal economic freedom. The colonial powers left, but they took everything with them. Infrastructure, institutions, trained professionals, gone. What remained were artificial borders, ethnic tensions, and economies designed to serve European industries, not African needs. The new African leaders faced an impossible question. How do we build nations from the ruins of colonialism? Nkrumah had an answer: unite. Not 50 separate weak nations, but one strong continental government. He famously said, "We must unite now or perish." He envisioned the United States of Africa, one currency, one military, one government. But other leaders weren't ready. They had just won their independence. They weren't eager to surrender it to some supranational authority. The debate came to a head in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in May 1963. 32 newly independent African nations gathered. Two camps emerged. The Casablanca group, led by Nkrumah and including radical leaders like Egypt's Nasser and Guinea's Sékou Touré, pushed for immediate political union, strong centralized power. The Monrovia group, led by more cautious leaders like Nigeria's Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and Ethiopia's Haile Selassie, wanted cooperation, not integration. They believed in sovereignty first, unity second. The Monrovia group won. On May 25, 1963, they formed the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. Its mandate was noble: promote solidarity, coordinate development, eradicate colonialism, defend sovereignty, and promote international cooperation. But here's what was missing: teeth. The OAU had no real power. It couldn't intervene in conflicts. It couldn't punish dictators. It operated on the principle of non-interference. Each nation was sacred and untouchable. For nearly 4 decades, the OAU would struggle with this fundamental weakness. It watched as coups destroyed governments. It stood silent as genocides unfolded. It became, in the eyes of many critics, a club for dictators to protect each other. By the 1990s, Africa was in crisis, and the OAU seemed powerless to respond. If you want to understand the African Union, you must understand Muammar Gaddafi. The Libyan leader was one of Africa's most controversial figures. To the West, he was a terrorist sponsor, a madman, a dictator. To many Africans, he was something else, a benefactor, a Pan-Africanist, a leader who put Africa first. Gaddafi came to power in Libya in 1969 through a military coup. He immediately positioned himself as a revolutionary, anti-Western, anti-imperialist, pro-Arab, and increasingly pro-African. By the 1990s, Libya was under international sanctions for its alleged role in terrorist attacks, including the 1988 Lockerbie bombing. Isolated by the West, Gaddafi turned to Africa. He poured Libyan oil money into African development projects. He funded infrastructure, schools, telecommunications. He championed the idea that Africa needed economic independence from former colonial powers. But Gaddafi's supporter came with strings. He was accused of interfering in African conflicts, supporting rebels, and destabilizing governments that opposed him. His vision for African unity was ambitious but autocratic. He wanted a United States of Africa with himself as a leading figure. In 1999, Gaddafi issued the Sirte Declaration calling for the OAU to be transformed into a more powerful African Union. He used his oil wealth and political influence to push reluctant African leaders toward this vision. Without Gaddafi, there might be no African Union. But his involvement also raised questions. Whose dream was this, really? And what would happen when he was gone? South Africa's Thabo Mbeki was Gaddafi's opposite. Intellectual, where Gaddafi was impulsive; diplomatic, where Gaddafi was confrontational. Mbeki represented a different vision for Africa's future. As deputy president and then president of South Africa, Mbeki championed the African Renaissance, a belief that Africa could rise through good governance, democracy, and self-reliance. He was a product of the anti-apartheid struggle, educated in exile, trained in strategy and patience. Mbeki pushed for the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, an economic plan that promised African-led development in exchange for improved governance. While Gaddafi threw money at problems, Mbeki negotiated structures and institutions. Together, these two very different leaders would shape the African Union, one providing resources and revolutionary energy, the other providing legitimacy and diplomatic skill. Not all key players were individuals, some were groups. The frontline states, nations like Tanzania, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana had fought together against colonialism and apartheid. They had experience cooperating across borders for liberation. They understood that Africa's problems required African solutions. Leaders like Tanzania's Julius Nyerere had been champions of Pan-Africanism since the 1960s. Though Nyerere had retired by 2002, his influence lived on. He had proven that African unity wasn't just theoretical, it could be practical, especially in the face of common enemies. But not everyone believed in the African Union dream. Some leaders saw it as a threat to their power. Others saw it as an expensive distraction from real problems. Nations like Nigeria and Egypt, giants of African politics, worried about losing influence in a united structure. Smaller nations feared being dominated by larger, wealthier neighbors. Outside Africa, Western powers watched nervously. A truly united Africa could challenge the post-colonial economic order. It could control its own resources, set its own terms, resist external manipulation. France, Britain, and the United States had spent decades maintaining influence through bilateral relationships with individual African nations. A strong African Union could change everything. The formation of the AU wasn't just an internal African affair. It was geopolitics, a power struggle over who would control Africa's future. To understand why the African Union was necessary, we must understand why the OAU failed. The Organization of African Unity began with high hopes. Its charter promised solidarity and coordination, but almost immediately cracks appeared. In 1967, the Biafran War erupted in Nigeria. The southeastern region attempted to secede, leading to a brutal 3-year conflict that killed over 1 million people, mostly through starvation. The OAU did nothing. Its principle of non-interference meant it couldn't take sides, couldn't intervene, couldn't save lives. In Uganda, Idi Amin launched one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships in the 1970s. He killed an estimated 300,000 people. The OAU remained silent. Why? Because Amin was a head of state, and the OAU protected heads of state, no matter their crimes. In 1994, Rwanda descended into genocide. In just 100 days, approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered. The OAU issued statements but took no action. It had no mechanisms for intervention, no peacekeeping forces, no authority to stop member states from committing atrocities. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Crisis emerges, OAU discusses, nothing happens. Critics called it the dictator's club. Leaders who committed human rights abuses in their own countries were welcomed at OAU summits. The organization seemed more interested in protecting sovereignty than protecting people. But the 1990s brought transformation. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The artificial divisions that had defined African politics for decades, capitalist versus communist, East versus West, suddenly meant nothing. At the same time, a new generation of African leaders emerged. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, who brought moral authority. Leaders like Uganda's Yoweri Museveni and Ethiopia's Meles Zenawi, who talked about self-reliance and good governance. They looked at the OAU and saw failure. They asked hard questions. Why can't we stop wars? Why can't we promote democracy? Why are we still so dependent on foreign aid and foreign intervention? In 1999, the OAU finally acknowledged its own inadequacy. At the Algiers summit, African leaders admitted that the organization needed fundamental reform. The world was changing. Africa needed to change with it. Enter Muammar Gaddafi. In September 1999, Gaddafi hosted an extraordinary OAU summit in Sirte, Libya. This wasn't a regular meeting, it was a call to revolution. Gaddafi made his case. The OAU is broken, it has failed to prevent conflicts, failed to promote development, failed to give Africa a voice in global affairs. He proposed something radical. Dissolve the OAU and create a new organization, a United States of Africa with supranational powers, a continental government, a single military, one economic union. The proposal shocked many leaders. It was Nkrumah's dream reborn, but 40 years later, and from a controversial messenger. Some leaders were enthusiastic, others were horrified, but everyone agreed on one thing. The status quo wasn't working. The Sirte Declaration was adopted. It called for the establishment of an African Union, but the details were left vague. What powers would it have? How would it be structured? Would it respect sovereignty or override it? The debate had begun. Between 1999 and 2001, African diplomats worked to hammer out the details. Two visions competed. Gaddafi's vision, strong central authority, immediate political integration, United States of Africa. Mbeki and others' vision, gradual integration, focus on economic development, respect for sovereignty with limited exceptions. The negotiations were intense. Smaller nations feared domination. Larger nations feared losing control. Some leaders genuinely believed in unity. Others saw it as a way to maintain their own power with a new institutional shield. Compromises were made. The African Union would be stronger than the OAU. It would have the right to intervene in grave circumstances like genocide, but it wouldn't be a superstate. Nations would retain sovereignty. It would promote economic integration through the African Economic Community, but it wouldn't force political union. It would have a Peace and Security Council to address conflicts, but interventions would require consensus. In July 2000 in Lomé, Togo, the Constitutive Act of the African Union was adopted. 49 countries signed it. 1 year later, after two-thirds had ratified it, it entered into force. The African Union was real. July 9, 2002, Durban, South Africa. The world watched as the Organization of African Unity held its final summit. That evening, it would officially dissolve. In its place, the African Union would be born. The symbolism was powerful. South Africa, once the continent's shame, the last bastion of white minority rule, was now its shining hope. Nelson Mandela, though retired, attended. Thabo Mbeki, as host, welcomed leaders from across the continent. 53 nations were represented, from tiny island nations like Seychelles to continental giants like Nigeria and Egypt, from democracies to dictatorships, from the wealthiest to the poorest. At midnight, the OAU banner was lowered. The AU flag, green with a golden map of Africa surrounded by stars, was raised. Speeches were made. Gaddafi called it Africa's moment. Mbeki spoke of renaissance and renewal. Alpha Oumar Konaré of Mali became the AU's first chairperson. But beneath the celebration, questions lingered. Would this new organization be different? Could Africa truly unite? Or was this just the OAU with a new name? The African Union was immediately tested. In 2003, conflict erupted in Darfur, Sudan. The Sudanese government launched a campaign of violence against African ethnic groups. Hundreds of thousands died. The AU faced its first major crisis. Unlike the OAU, the AU acted. It deployed the African Union mission in Sudan amidst 7,000 peacekeepers sent to protect civilians. For the first time, African soldiers were intervening in an African conflict under African command. But AMI struggled. Underfunded, under-equipped, and understaffed, the mission couldn't stop the violence. Eventually, the United Nations took over. The Darfur intervention showed both the AU's ambition and its limitations. It wanted to solve African problems with African solutions, but without sufficient resources, political will, or military capacity, it couldn't. Other challenges emerged. Burundi descended into civil war. The AU deployed peacekeepers, again underfunded and overwhelmed. Togo experienced a constitutional crisis. The AU suspended Togo until democratic order was restored, a move the OAU never would have made. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe presided over economic collapse and political violence. The AU issued statements but took no real action, revealing that old habits died hard. While peacekeeping grabbed headlines, the real work of the AU happened in meeting rooms and policy documents. The African Union wasn't just one institution, it was a system. The assembly of heads of state and government, the supreme decision-making body. The Executive Council of Foreign Ministers implementing decisions, the Pan-African Parliament representing Africa's people, though with limited powers. The Peace and Security Council responsible for conflict prevention and intervention. The African Court on Human and People's Rights enforcing human rights standards. The African Union Commission, the administrative bureaucracy running day-to-day operations, regional economic communities, building blocks for continental integration. Each institution faced challenges. The Pan-African Parliament struggled with legitimacy because most members were appointed, not elected. The Peace and Security Council lacked funding for its ambitious mandate. The Commission in Addis Ababa was plagued by bureaucracy and inefficiency, but slowly structures took shape. Protocols were signed, norms were established. The African Union began developing its own identity, separate from the Organization of African Unity's legacy. One of the AU's most ambitious goals was economic integration. Africa in 2002 was economically fragmented. 53 currencies, 53 sets of trade regulations, 53 different customs systems. Moving goods across African borders was often harder than shipping them to Europe. The AU inherited the African Economic Community framework from the OAU, which envisioned 6 stages of integration culminating in a single African common market by 2028. Regional economic communities like ECOWAS in West Africa, SADC in Southern Africa, and EAC in East Africa were meant to be building blocks. First, integrate regionally, then connect the regions, finally create one African market. Progress was slow. Regional communities competed with each other. Member states belonged to multiple communities with overlapping mandates. Protectionism remained strong. Leaders wanted to protect local industries, but there were victories. The African Union launched the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, where countries voluntarily submitted to reviews of their governance, encouraging accountability. NEPAD, Thabo Mbeki's economic initiative, became integrated into AU structures, coordinating infrastructure projects across borders. Plans for the African Continental Free Trade Area, FCFTA, began taking shape, a project that wouldn't be realized until 2019, but had its roots in these early AU years. One area where the AU tried to distinguish itself from the OAU was governance. The Constitutive Act included a groundbreaking provision: unconstitutional changes of government would not be tolerated. If a military coup overthrew a democratically elected leader, the AU would suspend that country. This was revolutionary. The OAU had accepted coups as a fact of African politics. The AU declared them unacceptable. Between 2002 and 2010, the AU suspended multiple countries: Central African Republic after a coup in 2003, Mauritania after a coup in 2005 and again in 2008, Guinea after a coup in 2008, Madagascar after an unconstitutional power transition in 2009. Suspension meant exclusion from AU meetings and potential sanctions. Sometimes it worked. Pressure forced restoration of constitutional order. Sometimes it didn't. Suspended countries simply waited out the AU, but the message was clear. The AU was trying to promote democratic norms, yet contradictions remained. Countries with authoritarian leaders, Gaddafi's Libya, Mugabe's Zimbabwe, Mubarak's Egypt, were full AU members in good standing because they hadn't come to power through coups. The AU could punish unconstitutional changes, but it struggled to address ongoing repression. Critics accused the AU of selective enforcement, quick to condemn coups but slow to challenge entrenched dictators. Here's what almost no one talks about: who paid for the African Union? The answer is uncomfortable: mostly non-Africans. In 2002, the AU's budget was approximately $43 million. By 2015, it had grown to about $417 million. But here's the shocking part: roughly 70% of the AU's budget came from foreign donors. The European Union, the United States, China, Gaddafi's Libya contributed significantly, but most African nations paid minimal dues. Some didn't pay at all. This created a fundamental contradiction. An organization meant to assert African independence was financially dependent on foreign powers, and whoever pays the bills has influence. European donors, for example, funded peacekeeping operations but attached conditions, reports, audits, alignment with European priorities. The AU couldn't plan long-term because funding was unpredictable and came with strings. In response, the AU eventually implemented the Kaberuka Initiative, named after Donald Kaberuka, which proposed a 0.2% levy on imports to fund the AU independently. By 2016, this was generating significant revenue, but for the first crucial decade, the AU was financially compromised. This is rarely discussed, but it explains why the AU sometimes seemed to echo Western priorities rather than African ones. Muammar Gaddafi was the AU's biggest champion and its biggest problem. Between 2002 and 2011, Gaddafi used AU summits as his personal stage. He arrived with elaborate motorcades, stayed in luxury tents, and delivered rambling speeches about African unity. He pushed constantly for his United States of Africa vision, one government, one army, him as a central figure. Other African leaders found him exhausting. His grandstanding disrupted proceedings. His interference in other countries' affairs created diplomatic nightmares, but his money kept flowing, funding AU projects, bailing out struggling nations, building infrastructure. In 2009, Gaddafi was elected as chairperson of the AU, a largely ceremonial rotating position. He used it to push his agenda harder, proposing a continental government with himself as its leader. Most African leaders resisted. They had learned from history. Giving one person too much power was dangerous. Then came 2011. The Arab Spring reached Libya. Rebels challenged Gaddafi's rule. NATO intervened, bombing Libyan government forces. The AU issued statements calling for dialogue, but NATO ignored them. The AU watched as one of its member states was attacked by foreign powers, and it could do nothing. Gaddafi was killed in October 2011. With him died the most forceful voice for rapid African integration. But his death also revealed an uncomfortable truth. The AU's biggest benefactor had been a dictator whom many Africans despised. What did that say about the organization? There's a question the AU has never fully answered. Could it have prevented the Rwandan genocide? The genocide happened in 1994, 8 years before the AU existed. The OAU did nothing, claimed non-interference, respected sovereignty, watched as 800,000 people died in 100 days. The AU was created in part because of Rwanda. Its constitutive act includes Article 4H, the right of the Union to intervene in a member state pursuant to a decision of the Assembly in respect of grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. This was revolutionary. The AU could override sovereignty to stop mass atrocities. But here's what's rarely discussed. Rwanda itself became skeptical of the AU. After the genocide, Rwanda rebuilt under Paul Kagame's leadership. Kagame believed African institutions had failed his people. He developed a philosophy, self-reliance above all. Rwanda would depend on no one. When the AU called for solidarity, Rwanda participated but kept its distance. When AU peacekeeping missions faltered, Rwanda often deployed its own forces instead. Acting unilaterally, the country that inspired the AU's intervention principle became one of its most independent members. The irony is profound. The African Union has 4 official languages: English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. Notice what's missing: African languages. Swahili, spoken by over 100 million people across East Africa, isn't an official AU language. Hausa, spoken by 70 million in West Africa, isn't official. Amharic, spoken in Ethiopia, the AU's headquarters, isn't official. This reflects a deeper truth. The AU is built on colonial foundations. Its borders are colonial. Its official languages are colonial. Even its vision of statehood, modern nation states with presidents and parliaments, is colonial. There's a hidden tension in Pan-Africanism. It seeks to unite Africa against colonialism while using structures and concepts inherited from colonialism. Some African intellectuals argue that true African unity requires decolonizing African minds, returning to indigenous systems of governance, economics, and social organization. But the AU doesn't seriously engage with this. It operates within the post-colonial framework, trying to make it work better rather than replace it entirely. This philosophical contradiction is rarely acknowledged in official AU discourse. Africa still has kingdoms. Morocco is a monarchy. Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, is ruled by King Mswati III. Lesotho has a king. Traditional kingdoms exist within nations like Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, and South Africa. The AU doesn't know what to do with them. The organization is built around modern nation states, but millions of Africans still identify first with their ethnic group or traditional kingdom, not their country. In some places, traditional leaders wield more legitimacy than elected officials. They mediate disputes, maintain customs, and command loyalty, yet they have no formal role in the AU system. This creates a disconnect. The AU claims to represent African peoples, but it only engages with one form of authority, the modern state. Traditional authorities, which have existed for centuries, are invisible in the continental vision. A truly representative African Union would need to reconcile modern and traditional governance. But this conversation rarely happens. Despite its limitations, the African Union has deployed peacekeepers to some of Africa's worst conflicts. Between 2002 and today, the AU has deployed missions to Burundi, AMIB, helping transition from civil war to peace. Sudan, Darfur, AMIS, attempting to protect civilians, later transitioned to UN-AU hybrid mission. Somalia, AMISOM, later ATMIS, fighting Al-Shabaab militants, stabilizing the government. Central African Republic, MISCA, responding to sectarian violence. The Gambia, supporting ECOWAS intervention to enforce election results in 2017. These missions saved lives. AMISOM in Somalia prevented the country from becoming a failed state entirely controlled by extremists. AU peacekeepers in Burundi helped end a brutal civil war. But AU peacekeeping faces chronic problems, funding shortages, missions are underfunded, undersupplied, and sometimes go months without paying soldiers. Capability gaps, a lack of training, equipment, and logistics compared to UN or NATO forces, mandate confusion, unclear rules of engagement, political interference from member states, accountability issues. Some AU peacekeepers have been accused of human rights abuses themselves. The AU's most successful interventions have been when regional organizations like ECOWAS take the lead, with the AU providing political backing. When the AU tries to lead directly, results are mixed. Still, the principle matters. Africans solving African problems. The AU has demonstrated that Africa can deploy its own forces to address its own crises. That's progress compared to the OAU's passivity. One of the AU's most tangible impacts has been on democratic norms. The principle of rejecting unconstitutional changes of government has become established. When coups happen, the AU suspends the country. This doesn't always restore democracy immediately, but it signals that coups are unacceptable. Since 2002, the AU has suspended at least 15 member states following coups or unconstitutional power transitions, refused to recognize governments that come to power through force. sent mediation teams to countries facing constitutional crises, monitored elections, and called out fraud in some cases. This is significant. In the OAU era, coups were routine and accepted. Now they carry consequences, but the AU's democracy promotion has limits. It reacts to coups, but struggles with authoritarian regimes that maintain a veneer of legitimacy. Presidents who rig elections, change constitutions to stay in power, or suppress opposition rarely face AU sanctions. Countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea have leaders who have ruled for decades through managed elections. The AU criticizes them quietly but takes no action. The AU can punish sudden unconstitutional changes but can't address slow authoritarian drift. Economic integration was one of the AU's founding goals. Progress has been slow but real. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, launched in 2019, is the AU's greatest economic achievement. It creates the world's largest free trade zone by number of countries. 54 African nations representing 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. AfCFTA aims to remove tariffs on 90% of goods, facilitate movement of people and capital, and boost intra-African trade. If successful, it could transform African economies from colonial-era extractive models to integrated industrial economies. But barriers remain. Infrastructure deficits, roads, railways, ports connecting African countries are inadequate. Non-tariff barriers, bureaucracy, corruption, and regulations still make cross-border trade difficult. Political will, some leaders fear competition will hurt local industries. Implementation gaps, signing agreements is easy, enforcement is hard. Still, progress is visible. Regional economic communities like ECOWAS have removed visa requirements for citizens traveling between member states. The East African community has a common passport. Cross-border infrastructure projects, railways, highways, power grids are being built. The vision of economic integration is alive, even if realization is slow. Perhaps the AU's most underestimated impact is on African identity. For centuries, colonial powers told Africans they were divided by tribe, by language, by region. Colonial education systems taught African children that their history began with European contact, that Africa had no civilization, no achievements, no unity. The African Union, despite its flaws, represents a counter-narrative. Africa is one. Africans share a common history, common struggles, and a common destiny. This psychological shift matters. A young person in Kenya now can see themselves as not just Kenyan, not just East African, but African. The AU passport, issued to diplomats and their officials, bears the words African Union above any national identity. African culture is increasingly crossing borders. Music from Nigeria's Afrobeats scene dominates charts across the continent. Films from Ghana, South Africa, and Nigeria circulate widely. Athletes compete under their national flags but are celebrated as African heroes. The AU hasn't created this Pan-African identity alone, but it has provided institutional backing for it. It has made Africa a legitimate political category, not just a geographical one. Before the AU, African countries often spoke with 50 different voices on the world stage. Colonial powers and superpowers exploited these divisions. The AU gives Africa a collective voice, however imperfect. At the United Nations, the African group coordinates positions on climate change, trade negotiations, international security. Africa increasingly speaks as a bloc. This has yielded results. Africa secured permanent representation in G20 discussions. African priorities, debt relief, fair trade, climate justice get more attention. Multinational corporations and foreign governments now negotiate with the AU Commission, not just individual countries. But challenges remain. Africa's voice is only as strong as its unity. When African countries disagree, as they often do, the collective voice weakens, and Africa still lacks permanent representation on the UN Security Council, despite repeated AU demands for reform. Still, the trend is clear. Africa is moving from being acted upon to being an actor. The AU is central to that transformation. One impact rarely discussed is the institutional culture the AU has created. Thousands of African diplomats, technocrats, and civil servants now work within AU structures. They meet regularly, develop personal relationships, build networks across borders. This creates a class of professionals who think continentally, not just nationally. The AU has also created norms and standards. When countries write new constitutions, they reference AU principles. When regional courts make decisions, they cite AU human rights frameworks. When civil society groups advocate for change, they invoke AU commitments. This normative power, the ability to set standards for what is acceptable, may be the AU's most lasting legacy. So what does the African Union really represent? On paper, it's an intergovernmental organization, bureaucratic, political, often frustrating. It has achieved some successes and suffered many failures. It deploys peacekeepers that sometimes work and sometimes don't. It promotes norms that sometimes stick and sometimes don't. It's perpetually underfunded, sometimes ineffective, and frequently contradictory. But here's the deeper truth. The African Union represents something profound: Africa's refusal to accept the world as it was handed to them. Think about what colonialism did. It told Africans they were inferior. It divided them artificially. It extracted their resources and returned nothing. It left them with borders designed to keep them weak, economies designed to serve foreign interests, and political systems designed to fail. The African Union is Africa's declaration. We will not accept this. We will rewrite our story. We will unite what you divided. We will reclaim what you took. We will define ourselves, not be defined by you. This is what makes the AU significant even when it fails. Every AU summit, every peacekeeping mission, every trade agreement, every instance of standing together, it's an act of resistance against a colonial legacy that tried to make African unity impossible. The question isn't whether the AU has achieved its full vision. It hasn't. The question is whether the vision itself matters. And it does. Because here's what critics miss. Nation building takes time. The United States, the model everyone points to, fought a civil war 85 years after independence. The European Union, another model, took decades to develop and is still struggling with unity. China's current form emerged after centuries of fragmentation and civil war. Africa is attempting continental integration barely 60 years after most countries gained independence. The artificial colonial borders are still fresh. The wounds of exploitation are still healing. The economic dependency is still being unwound. In that context, the African Union's mere existence is remarkable. That 54 countries with different languages, cultures, political systems, and economic interests can sit together and negotiate a common future. That's not weakness. That's extraordinary. The big lesson of the African Union is this: healing from colonialism is not a policy, it's a process. Unity is not a destination, it's a practice. And Africa's story is not written by its past. It's being written by its choices. The African Union is Africa choosing itself. The African Union in 2002 was born from hope and desperation. Hope that Africa could be more than the sum of its divided parts, and desperation born from decades of watching those divisions exploited. Today, more than 2 decades later, the AU is still evolving. It has expanded from peacekeeping to economic integration. It has launched the African Continental Free Trade Area. It has responded to coups and crises. It has given Africa a collective voice, however imperfect. But the dream of true continental unity, one Africa, one voice, one future, remains incomplete, as perhaps it always will be. Perhaps the point was never to achieve perfect unity, but to keep choosing unity despite the reasons to divide. What's clear is this: the story of the African Union is the story of Africa's post-colonial journey. Every success reveals how far Africa has come. Every failure reveals how far there is to go. And every choice to stay together, despite the pressures to fracture, is a victory against a history designed to keep Africans apart. The African Union is far from perfect, but it exists. And in a world that spent centuries betting against African unity, that existence itself is revolutionary. If this story moved you, if it taught you something you didn't know, if it made you see Africa differently, please subscribe to Africa Hidden History. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe the African Union can achieve true continental unity? What would that unity look like? What obstacles do you think are most difficult to overcome? Next episode, we are diving into another hidden chapter of African history. Until then, remember, Africa's story is still being written, and you're part of it.